Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Jen Williams. I'm the Northern correspondent at the Financial Times, and it's a pleasure to be here today, especially on such a beautiful sunny day. My train actually arrived on time, as expected, so the day is going swimmingly so far. So the discussion that we are about to have is going to focus on urban regeneration and how we reimagine our cities, which is a topic of huge interest to me personally, having written about those kinds of issues for a long time, or certainly in the north of England anyway. And the expertise of the fantastic panel that we have got here, who I will introduce in a moment, it gives us the chance to go local, so to look at some of the context specifically here and around here in this part of the country, but also the UK context and globally too, looking at how it's done elsewhere. And the role education, social enterprise and business has to play in that. And it feels particularly timely to be doing this in York, as North Yorkshire gears up for its first devolution deal. So I'm sure that will probably be a thread that we will pull at some point during the discussion. And it's also, from my point of view, this is also the first in a series of events about regional economic growth that's been put together by the RSA, the Cape Fellowship Programme and the N8 Group of Northern Research Universities. So keep an eye out for further events over the next 7 or 8 months or so in different northern towns and cities. So let's introduce you to our panel, starting from my immediate left. Charlie Jeffery is Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of York. Joanna Pollard is from Social Enterprise UK, where she's Programme Lead for eBay for Change. Ellie White is Students Reinventing Cities Project Officer at C40 Cities, part of the Urban Planning and Design team in the Department of Climate Solutions and Networks. And finally, last but not least, Andrew Farrimond is Infrastructure Lead at Aviva Capital Partners. So you have heard probably enough from me, so I will hand over to each of our panel for some opening remarks.
Thank you. I'm wearing two hats, University of York, and I'll flip it to the chair of the N8 partnership of 8 research universities in the north towards the end of my comments. I've been asked to say a little bit about the role of universities in economic regeneration. I think there are 3 things that we do. Firstly, we do research which opens up new technologies and their applications, which open up new economic activity. Second, we educate students who become graduates, who take that insight from our research into their careers. And third, we convene. We're good at bringing people together. And when that works, I think you have a powerful recipe for economic regeneration. And I want to ask 3 questions in this few minutes. Firstly, what's the opportunity in York, picking up on some of the stuff about devolution in particular? Secondly, how might we take it? And then thirdly, opening out what opportunities, what contribution can this make on a broader front in the UK as a whole? So the opportunity, firstly. Well, I think that we have 2 really significant changes afoot in and around York. The first is devolution, the establishment of the combined mayoral authority of York and North Yorkshire, which will begin to take shape towards the end of this year and will be capped off by the election of a mayor in May next year. That will put economic development into a bigger geographical frame, and I think there's an opportunity, like we've seen performed by Andy Street in the West Midlands, Andy Byrne in Manchester, Tracy Braben in West Yorkshire, to build shared purpose across both administrative and party political boundaries. Second big opportunity is the hot phase of the development of the York Central site, one of the biggest brownfield sites in Europe, right next to the best connected railway station in the UK. That site, if it is developed well, will be an asset not just for York, but also for the region if we get it right. So how to take those opportunities? Well, I think the watchword has to be about innovation. It's about harnessing emerging technologies which can generate and anchor here in York for the wider region innovative clusters of economic development. I think we know some of the areas where that could happen. Some will pick up on traditional strengths. This is an old railway town, which is now actually at the heart of AI-led rail tech. Other aspects of this will connect city and rural economy, York and North Yorkshire, in particular through the bioeconomy and the Bio Yorkshire programme being run by a number of partners, including the University in York, looking at applications of new technologies in farming, in materials, in energy. And there'll be other opportunities where we can connect York westward towards Leeds, especially around creative technologies. Realising all of that, I think, has two prerequisites. The first, those roles that universities play in research, in educating graduates, in convening people. That can build the kind of partnership working between universities, businesses, colleges, local government, that can work especially well in places which have short lines of communication, which we certainly do here in York. And then secondly, I think it needs a really dynamic and creative vision for the development of the York Central site, which centres on how we can best nurture and incubate new businesses, draw in long-term investment as well as short-term venture funding to get those businesses off the ground. Turning briefly to my final question, what can all this mean for the UK economy more broadly? And that's where I put the N8 hat on. The UK economy is hobbled by a north-south divide in investment and productivity, public and private investment and productivity. Devolution is beginning to decentralise resources and leadership. If we can use that to build from the ground up and moving away from, it has to be said, the failure of Whitehall-led efforts to rebalance the UK economy, if we can empower local and regional development partnerships around our universities, then we're going to have a better chance around York, Leeds, Sheffield, Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, Lancaster to narrow that north-south gap. And that will benefit the whole of the UK, not just the north of the UK. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So it's lovely to be back in York. I was a member of the York Fair Trade Forum for a number of years, up until quite recently. And in that first lockdown summer 3 years ago, I was spearheading the campaign to keep Kit Kat fair trade. And that included a day of action at the Nestle factory in York. And as part of that campaign, so many people contacted me, including the great-granddaughter of Henry Roundtree, because the factory had been a Roundtree's factory, and the Roundtrees did a huge amount in terms of investing in York, in terms of building houses and looking after their employees, and they were renowned, the Quaker chocolatiers were renowned as being really good employers. And then Nestle came along and bought it, and there was an awful lot of consternation in York about this. So what I found during the course of my campaign was that an awful lot of people around the globe hate Nestle. I got 250,000 signatures on my petition, and I'm under no illusions that all of those people really care about chocolate farmers in Côte d'Ivoire. They just hated Nestle. So one of the things that we need to do is to get back to the not philanthropic nature necessarily, but we need to get back to employers feeling like they have a responsibility to employees, and not only to employees, but the communities that surround the people that work for them. And so Social Enterprise UK is all about that. There are around about 100,000 social enterprises in the UK, and they put something like £60 billion into the economy, employing 2 million people. It would be great if that was higher. It would be wonderful if that was higher. One of the characteristics of a social enterprise is that they commit by law, because they have to embed it into their articles of association, that half of their profits or more have to go into their social mission. So that's either supporting the marginalised people or the environment, so a social or environmental mission. Now, if you think about where we are with water companies, and if every single water company in the UK was a social enterprise and half of their profits had to be spent on cleaning up the rivers, would we have Fergal Sharkey on Twitter every single day criticising them. If every single electricity company had to spend half of its profits forever on not only clean energy, but supporting the communities that work with them. If every single company was a social enterprise, imagine what we could do. Imagine what we could achieve with that. Big business is extractive. And what we need to get to is a regenerative rather than an extractive. So in not extracting the resources from the staff to the extent that we have Amazon employees weighing in bottles because they can't afford to take the time to go to the loo. We need to move away from extracting fossil fuels. We need to move away from extraction to regeneration and social enterprise because they have to, and they want to, and they will. So that's what the debate is, how do we get there?
Hi everyone, my name's Ellie. I'm here today from C40 Cities. So I'm sure for many of you, this is the first time you're hearing about C40 Cities. So we are a network of almost 100 mayors from our world-leading cities that are taking urgent action to combat the impacts of the climate crisis. So we work with cities and mayors to support them in halving their emissions by 2030 and staying in line with the 1.5 Paris Agreement. One of the ways we do that, and what I'm here to talk to you about today, is our Reinventing Cities programme, which is part of our urban planning and design workstream. So I specifically work on the Students Reinventing Cities competition, which is part of this programme. So let me explain. We have 3 competitions, and I want to talk about the way that this framework could be used as an example, as a way to bring together different voices from civil society, city governments, businesses, to come together and collaborate and think of proposals, ways to reimagine urban sites that are green, so benefit the environment, and thriving, benefit the people that live there. So let me just break down these 3 competitions for you quickly. We first of all have the classic Reinventing Cities competition. This was the first one that we launched in 2017 with Mayor Hidalgo from Paris. The aim of this competition is to bring together teams of professionals, architects, urban planners, you name it, to reimagine a space in the city that X amount of cities in the world will have identified, to reimagine it in a net zero way. We've had 20 cities participate in this project, over 3,500 businesses get involved, and we currently have 38 projects in development based on winning this competition. This is very important as it's actually been very pioneering in setting national standards. So for example, in the US, the winning project in Chicago was the first high-rise social building block that was net zero. And in Paris, the project developed the first zero-carbon neighborhood in Paris. Then we have Students Reinventing Cities, which is what I specifically work on. So that's aged 18 to 28. We work with young people and students across the globe. Again, a similar principle. So a city will identify a site that they would like to reimagine, and students across the world come together to develop proposals and ways to reimagine that site. So to date, we've had 28 cities across the globe participate, over 200 universities and 2,000 students across the globe. So yeah, really exciting. And finally, the latest addition to this programme is our Schools Reinventing Cities competition, last but not least. This is aimed at an even younger age demographic, so school children from ages 10 to 18, in collaboration with Minecraft Education. So again, taking the principle of a city identifying a site to reimagine, but using the Minecraft world in classrooms with teachers to reimagine spaces. And yeah, my specific, I guess, area that I work on is working with young people to engage them in climate action, giving them the resources, whether that be through Minecraft Education or real-life case studies from cities across the globe, to think about tangible solutions, have these real-life case studies to reimagine the cities that we want to live in the future, and essentially just, yeah, being the voice of that. Ooh, no, it's being the voice of providing that educational change. So, yeah, that's all from me for now. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Andrew. I work with Aviva, and Aviva, I think, picking up on what Joanna was saying earlier, is an employer that I've joined recently, which I think, in part, because I think it takes its purpose really seriously. In 2020, in sort of as the pandemic was just sort of, perhaps getting on top of it, Aviva's made a number of commitments around, firstly, sustainability and community investment and thinking about its impact, and that's led to a number of things. We've got a ventures business thinking about innovation. We've had some climate transition funds to try and show some leadership in what financial institutions can do in and around the carbon transition. And we've set up this year what's called Aviva Capital Partners, which is looking to get into earlier stage development. So despite the fact that we're long-term patient capital as a financial institution by nature, actually, unless you get in there at the early development stage, it's not as easy to shape the sort of investment that you need. And when we start talking about cities in particular, our view is that it's a long-term partnership that you need in order to have the sort of effect on development that involves. In terms of how we think about cities, I mean, I think one of the things that strikes me, I'm glad creativity's already come up. In a way, cities don't necessarily drive the word creativity, but I think the RSA had a blog out yesterday thinking again about the importance of creativity in cities. I think the second thing that's really struck me is the need for a pace of change. Charlie commented on the fact that there's quite a lot of opportunity to improve a number of our urban areas for the future economy, for properly sustainable lives, but also inclusive growth that thinks about those dimensions right from the outset. And so that pace, I think, will drive some of the discussion, and pace often drives the need for creativity as well. I think the final sort of topic on cities for me is, as an investor, I happen to have spent quite a bit of my career on infrastructure investment, energy, water, transport. Whilst some of my colleagues have lived in a real estate and property world, thinking about cities and commercial real estate and so on. And actually they've felt to me like two different worlds within finance. And one of the things that I think is really interesting in terms of some of the nature of what it takes to reimagine a city is starting from scratch, and you can't take energy and water for granted. You've got to think about the UK's position on the carbon content of heat. And then the final thing I want to say, and we might come on to a bit more about the devolution deals in Yorkshire and elsewhere, is that if you want to, as a city, to have partnerships with private capital that are long-term and patient, you need to be the sort of counterparty that can credibly take that long-term role. So the key feature for us in terms of the devolution deals is being able to deal with local areas. I think of them in a way as empowerment deals rather than devolution deals, because it's less about what central government does or does not give a local area. It's actually more whether or not the local area has the levers it needs to be able to sort of own the sort of regeneration it wants to feature. And I think the devolution deals are really key to actually setting out what that means as a two-way relationship. But then also living the deal and working out what that means over time in terms of the resources of central government, the ability to bring stakeholders together and have a really shared, durable vision on what you can do, so that you can then talk realistically to investors about what the public sector side of that is, so you can then each focus on what the economy and growth opportunity is around that, and have, even if you bring different interests to the table, have a sense of shared endeavour.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So the theme of the panel is reimagining cities, and so I kind of wanted to start with the question, do we actually need to reimagine our cities, and if so, why do we need to reimagine them? And if we're going to do that, where should we be looking for inspiration, whether it's, you know, good examples in this country, but also anything that might be happening internationally? And I thought with your kind of global hat, you might have some thoughts, Ellie.
Yeah, so I would say definitely there is a need to reimagine cities. I mean, in my program, currently I work with 12 cities, and you can definitely see that, for example, in Sao Paulo, Amman, Durban in South Africa, over the past, you know, decades, we've seen such a huge urban sprawl, and we've grown cities in a way that prioritizes cars and private vehicle use. So the cities that we currently live in are designed this way. They're not designed necessarily, or they haven't been developed in a way that's on a human scale and that are people-centered. So I think, you know, even though in my program we have these 12 different cities and the sites they're choosing to reimagine vary, you know, Sao Paulo is a transport hub, Freetown is like a mini football stadium, but I think the key that underpins it, that we advocate for and we want students' proposals to bear in mind, is how can these places be more people-centered. So it's thinking about connectivity, both physically through cycle paths, pedestrianised zones, and digitally. You know, how can you get there? How is this area connected in the virtual world? Is it easily accessible via internet? Things like that. So, yeah, I would say definitely there is a need to rethink the model that's currently in place through this lens of being a citizen, a resident, a visitor, at the very human scale.
Yeah, I suppose bringing it right the way down to the local in terms of York, Charlie, I mean, what do we need to do to reimagine, I suppose, the future, I suppose, because we're talking about where the city might go next, right? Yeah.
Well, all cities have to renew themselves. Yeah. I mean, this was a much more industrial city in the older sense of the word. A few decades ago, with the rail industry, with chocolates and big factories. They're now much smaller. So there's, you know, you have to do something to renew and to provide new opportunities. I'd personally say York has relied far too much on the hospitality economy, the visitor economy, and not on renewing higher value activity. So that's one of the key things I think we need to think about. We also renew in different ways. Priorities change. So environmental sustainability wouldn't have been a central priority even a decade ago that it is now. And I think we have to think very hard about how we renew. That's perhaps the economic sectors, but also the ways in which we share as a city and its communities some of the objectives that we now think are much more important than they used to be. There's something about values there. You talked about, you know, the Roundtree values, and yeah, they were great in most respects. A concern for the quality of working conditions and a campaigning vigour which influenced national policy as well. So how can you renew that in contemporary circumstances? I say that partly because Aviva and we at the university and other stakeholders were signatories of the Good Business Charter and a claim of York to be the first good business city under that charter, which brings together all sorts of commitments around environmental sustainability, around things like paying taxes and not trying to avoid them, around fair work, so real living wage commitments and so on. And I think, you know, that's an opportunity for us as we renew and, you know, think about those new industries that can take the place of the old. It's how we do it, which is as important as what we do.
And where do you see, I mean, you touched on some of the sectors in your kind of exposition at the beginning. I mean, you talk about maybe needing to rely a little bit less on the tourism economy. Like, where do you kind of see that opportunity from here?
Well, one thing I'll say a little bit more about is the Bio-Yorkshire Partnership, which is University of York working with Askham Bryan College, which is a land-based college, and Ferra Science, which is a former government lab which offers commercial services to the agri-food sector. We put together a programme which is harnessing fantastic research advances in biotechnology in ways which can, on the one hand, improve the productivity of agriculture, reduce the carbon emissions or increase the carbon capture of agriculture, but also through the uses of the starches that we grow in our plants to find ways of reducing our dependence on fossil fuels for materials like plastics or clothes, and potentially energy sources which don't rely on fossil fuels. Now that's I think something that combines the economic renewal with the values. I think York is wonderfully situated for that because we have those assets, a university at the forefront in that field, churning out graduates who take that with them, a land-based college, making sure that we can cover the whole skills spectrum, and a commercial capability through FERA. Now that's a unique set of possibilities which doesn't exist anywhere else in the UK or probably internationally. And I think that gives us this opportunity to place the city of York and those institutions in it at the heart of the regeneration, not just of the city economy, but the rural economy around it. That's a huge prize.
Andrew, you talked about the role that patient capital has in all of this. I mean, in your kind of financial sector, as it were, when you look at cities and you look at investing in cities, what kind of needs to change from where we're at the moment? Like, how could it work better than it does at the moment?
I mean, I think the first thing to recognise is that, well, I commented before on the importance of designing, things in, from the start. But I think just sheer delivery is quite difficult, just in terms of the scale of some of the investment, the nature of city areas, and so I think just the sense of a partnership approach that doesn't have to be specific to a single investor, but it has to be an ability to understand what private capital doesn't need, but also the private capital to realise what the expectations of local areas are and then fit into them. I think the second thing is just in terms of the conversations we've had in particular cities and particular combined authorities just this year, just demonstrate how different individual cities are and the need to I mean, yes, the energy challenge is similar. Yes, transport challenges. Yes, retrofit and social and affordable housing are challenges almost everywhere. So there are some very common themes, but actually the nature of what different places need is really important. And so the idea of just coming and saying, well, I offer some affordable housing, or I can do commercial real estate, or I can help a university, it doesn't seem to wash anymore, because in part, if you want the connectivity within the place, you need to think about those mixed schemes. So the ability to think holistically, I think, becomes more important in that. And that just means you need to start the conversation earlier. And you need to, be genuinely committed to then staying for it and understanding that and finding like-minded people across the sector. So we've found some developers that we think have shared values with Aviva that we will then be more likely to work with. We're thinking about some schemes that in order to get efficiencies across different cities, ways of approaching energy or heat or so on that can help accommodate that. But there's always going to be this slightly weird thing. You need the local connectivity to people generally to sort of cluster and work together. You also need connectivity between places to be able to have a sort of a national sense of that growth rather than always being place specific. And then you overlay on that the sort of the digital environment as well to just make sure that when we talk about inclusive growth, you've got those layers of connectivity rather than just perhaps lazily saying, I just need a very, very dense central area with lots of housing as close as possible. It takes more thought than that.
It's more complex than that, yeah. And Joanna, from your point of view, you talked about at the start kind of almost needing a different structure to the economy or a different shape to the economy almost. Like when you look at cities, does the degree of appetite for that vary from place to place? Like, are there cities that you have been to where you've thought, actually, they're really embracing this, they're making progress? Like, how does it look from your perspective?
Yes, certainly. So Social Enterprise UK about 10 years ago decided that it wanted to instigate a system very similar to fair trade towns and cities called social places, so social enterprise places. So they go from something as large as Cumbria, but plenty of cities, so Oxford and Bath and Plymouth. Plymouth is a brilliant example. There's a huge amount of social enterprises and they're all connected and they're connected with each other. And they form almost a decision-making block, so they can come together and help each other and help the local authority and help all the other infrastructure that's going on in Plymouth. And they're responsible, because there's a lot of co-op stores who were also a social enterprise, they're responsible for something like 25% of that city's economy, which is extraordinary. And something like that, it's definitely possible. If you have the infrastructure to support each other, that social enterprises can be a really strong part of any city. And it feels like people who understand business, but understand the necessity for business to operate not just with profit, but with people and planet. That triple bottom line is so important. And I think any city that embraces that kind of support is going to thrive.
So I think, we've talked a bit about what cities need to look like, particularly from, Ellie, you were talking about the way that they've been designed over time to kind of be car-focused and all that kind of thing. But what you kind of can't separate all of this from is politics, right? So every city will have a lively debate, I am sure, about what growth should look like, what design should look like, and how you make a city successful while balancing the kind of different needs of the people who are already there versus the people that you might want to go and live there in the future. So I suppose I wanted to kind of maybe come on a little bit to that balance between preservation and growth, which is perhaps quite a live thing in York, but I mean, I'm from Manchester and it's a live thing in Manchester as well. And I mean, that then creates a tension around how you make somewhere that is affordable for the next generation to stay in, whether those are graduates, whether those are people that have grown up there, right? So how you balance that out. And I mean, Ellie, you obviously do a lot of stuff with young people. Like, what is your take on how to strike that balance in British cities when you have a kind of, the politics of it means that you do have to take people with you, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so like, how do you see that?
Yeah, so I think on the first point you mentioned about politics, obviously C40, we work with cities, we work with mayors. So, for example, in Barcelona, the mayor just lost her seat. Unfortunately, she was really a pioneer of the Barcelona Superblock initiative and works very closely with us. But now, we don't know what the future of our work is going to look like, towards the end of this year when the new mayor comes in. So I think, we are working within a framework that, can be somewhat limiting. I think it is important to strike the balance. And I think what we really try to do with these competitions is bring together different voices, so whether that be students and young people having the opportunity to present their ideas to city governments, or in the professional edition, architects, urban planners, working with cities to be able to implement these proposals. I think it's very important to give that space for collaboration and for the opportunity of sharing ideas, hearing from people from different backgrounds, and I think that is kind of the way we can move forward. And I think hopefully what I would like to see through this competition and kind of through the future generation, at the moment we're still, we're fighting the battle of making the case of why we need change. I'm hoping that in the future we won't need to make that battle and people can see the rationale for why we need people-centered spaces, and then we can move forward with kind of the logistics of implementing them.
Yeah, I suspect you've probably got thoughts, Charlie, about how this might look from the York perspective.
Well, you talked about the politics of development. This is a city which hasn't had a local plan for 50 years. It might get one later this year, which will provide some level of planning guidance on a stable basis. So that says something about how difficult things have been in York. And one of the things that York really lacks is housing, or at least housing that's affordable to those people who will be the future of our economy, that is young people. It's increasingly difficult for students to find the backstreet terraces in which generations of students have lived, but it's also increasingly difficult for early career academics and others at the university to find somewhere in the city to live. So I think one of the crucial things for us to think about in the coming years is how to change that situation, and that will require us to build some new stuff and to lose some of the allergy that we have to building new housing. I think it also requires us to think differently about how we regulate. It is much, much harder for a landlord to meet the regulatory requirements to rent out to houses of multiple occupancy, students or other typically younger people, than it is to rent a property out as an Airbnb. Yeah? Now that seems to me to be a misallocation of priority, which contributes to the shortage of permanent housing in the city, because so much of it has now been swallowed up into visitor economy housing. Now we can change that, but I see we've got the odd councillor in the audience. We can change that, and I think we really should seek to change that, so that those who are the future economy, our young people, can actually afford to live here.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts, Andrew, from an investor point of view?
Well, I think one of the things that's firstly, I think in terms of the mixed use I've commented before, actually thinking about through an area and where housing fits into that is totally essential at the design stage. I think one of the things that struck me from cities generally is I had not been particularly familiar with what the ownership of social housing has been in different areas. And then when you start thinking about provision or retrofit or how new build might fit into those structures, that's my sense is that's in areas that's specifically different across cities across the UK in terms of what that mix looks like, and where do you go with it. But I just wanted to pick up your point, Jen, on sort of preservation versus new. Ellie's commented on the people aspect of that, but on the planet aspect, as Joanna was saying, embodied carbon is increasingly driving. There's an architectural question of where's the value that you can generate from existing stock, and just in terms of preserving architecture, blending it in with new, and making sure that a place has a feel to it that meets some of those stakeholder objectives. But I think also just the what is the carbon footprint of pulling stuff down and building everything new, is that's adding what I think is a helpful dimension into that overall perspective.
I just wanted to, finally, before we take questions from the floor, we've talked a fair bit along the way about the fact that there's a devolution deal coming, and obviously that's not unique to North Yorkshire. There's a fair number of places across the country that are about to get their first deal in the next year or so, and other places have obviously had a degree of devolution for quite some time, and I'm just interested to kind of know, and perhaps you, Charlie, you've touched on it already, what the North Yorkshire devolution deal in particular might mean in terms of opportunities here, but also, how that might vary for, say, North Yorkshire in comparison to, some of the other places that have already got them.
Well, the devolution deal is, I think it's best to see it as an initial framework. It does decentralise some responsibilities, it does decentralise some resources, but not at the moment a huge amount. Some of those resources can be used to raise debt, so that means you can at least do some capital investment in important areas. And that's great, and that's something which I think can open our vision out across the administrative boundaries within which we have worked hitherto across York and North Yorkshire. We used to have how many district councils was it in North Yorkshire, Ian? 7. Okay, 7. So we had 8 administrative units within this area without a very large population. I think that could often, while it offered opportunities to respond to communities, it could often get in the way of thinking bigger picture. So we have that opportunity now. I think what we need to have as our aspiration is to use those initial powers and funding sources well, so that when further opportunities emerge down the line, it's a natural thing to give those resources and leadership. I think you were talking about empowerment. I think it's a great way of putting it. The empowerment away from Whitehall to think about how priorities that can be defined and delivered here can be pursued. Now, we've seen certainly in Manchester and in the West Midlands additional responsibilities decentralised and additional financial capabilities decentralised. I'd love us to be in that position. I'm a political scientist by background. I've studied the UK political system for a long time, and it's not very good at balanced economic... I thought you were just going to stop there. not very good at balanced economic development. You know, it seems to be extraordinarily easy to produce a new 40-mile railway line in London. Seems to be extraordinarily difficult to do it here between Manchester and Leeds and extending out beyond them. Now, that would be an absolute game changer. Yeah. So, you know, something's not worked in the Whitehall-led model, so let's give responsibility to people in the region. Yeah,
Joanna, from a social enterprise point of view, like, are you, when you see some of the decentralisation, it's obviously limited decentralisation, but the kind of development of that, does that look like an opportunity from your point of view to potentially perhaps feed in also to what Andrew was saying as well about the ability to kind of have pragmatic conversations with people locally so that each side understands each other? Is that also, does it make it more likely that you can create a thriving ecosystem of social enterprises if you've got more of that decision-making power locally, do you think?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah. It feels like if you've got a person that you can speak to whose responsibility it is to support their particular region. And actually one of the interesting things is the competition between them, because we have people like obviously Andy Burnham and Joe Anderson and all of the, lots of other metro mayors coming together. And everybody wants to be the first to do a thing. Yeah. Whatever it is, they want to be the first to do it. So if they can innovate in the business sector, and well, in anything, but certainly from a social enterprise point of view, if they can see that the future of enterprise is social, and they can see that there's a way of supporting businesses in their area to have that social mission, that environmental mission, to drive things forward. And rather than it being a sort of donation model, if it's about enterprise, it's about making it self-sustaining, so it needn't cost them very much, which is obviously another consideration. So yeah, it's a real opportunity for us to do something really interesting in those places.
I mean, you've already touched on this, Andrew, but in the places where there has been a degree of devolution, where you do have this kind of, focal point in terms of a mayor, have you noticed a difference in the way that you are having conversations, the way you're going about business and investment?
I do think particularly in sort of cities and urban areas where the difference between a mayor in a sort of combined authority context versus trying to engage with a number of different local authorities. You can't cut the local authorities out of the combined authority discussion, absolutely not. But being able to have that focal point where people work out what they want so that you can engage with it and have that as a partnership over time, I think is key. And to the extent that these areas need to do some enabling work, either physical or in terms of bringing stakeholders together, I think the sort of the convening point and the focus of that is helped a lot. I think having seen some of the devolution deals, there was always my concern, having worked in government, that they'd all basically look identical because devolution was going to be this thing that everyone gets. And reading the Yorkshire and North Yorkshire thing, I think one of the things that's really noticeable in it is the specific reference to regeneration schemes, the specific reference to Bio Yorkshire, the sense of, you know, identifying already before you've even got the mayor what some of those stakeholder groups are, I think is a real positive for it. I think the flip side to empowerment is earned autonomy, and I think one of the things that combined authority will, you know, need to do here is build that capacity. Everyone help it build and see there's value, because there will always be a little bit of a tension between central government and the region, the combined authority, and so the sense of having someone who feels it's their job to make that right all the time, to be able to get the benefits that it unlocks. One of the criticisms I've heard recently of some of the existing deals is how inflation is dealt with, which seems a sort of technical aspect, but if it erodes the value over time, and it then matters, how do you see the deal? Do you see the deal as what are we signing next year in this case? Or is it how do we then take what we've signed and run it over 30 years? Because the area is going to change, the ambition is going to change, and some of those, you know, tiers of government will have you know, changing objectives. And I think so. I think seeing it as a living relationship that's focused on a political, you know, structure is better than just what's this document.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know whether you have thoughts on this, Charlie, but is there a sense that actually some of these deals are going to need to be given the space to breathe, because actually Greater Manchester was the first out of the traps and they didn't get to where they got to overnight. There had been many years in the lead up to that, and if a devolution deal in North Yorkshire or somewhere like that doesn't immediately overnight work perfectly, and it takes time to build that capacity, and it doesn't immediately show outcomes on a graph, it doesn't necessarily mean that it should be ditched.
Quite right, but I think the phrase earned autonomy is a very good one, and if we can get it right, and when I say we, it's not just the mayor, it's going to be the constituent local authorities, it's going to be the business sectors which are important in this region, it's going to be the universities and colleges working in partnership. If we get it right, and if it brings over time additional benefits in the way that we described earlier in this session, then it should evolve in the way that it has done in other parts of England.
I'm going to throw this out to the floor for questions. Oh, that's good. It's good to see hands going up. Well, I think the guy in the green T-shirt over here, I think, was the first person to put his hand up. So.
Okay, look. I'm Phil Bixby. I'm here as half of My Future York and part of York Central co-owned Yoko. York has a difficulty with change. If you go out on the streets and ask people what they think the city should be like in 10 years or 20 years, as I've done, they will say, oh, don't change it, keep it the same, don't change it. If you ask the same people the question, do you think the city has changed in the last 20 or 10 years? And everyone will say, oh, God, yes, hasn't it? So there's a mismatch there about an acknowledgement that change is a process which is inevitable, which happens to us, but almost an unwillingness to get involved in it. And I think part of that is how, around a question about how we shift people from being residents of the city to being citizens of the city, and I heard the word citizen being used a couple of times, which is brilliant. And I think that needs to be part of how you make that process of being a citizen creative. Andrew, you talked about getting involved early enough, and I think, you know, for you that's important. For the citizens of York, it's also important. Charlie's mentioned the fact that we will hopefully have a long-awaited local plan, the 50-year wait for the local plan. There'll be another one along in 10 years. How do we start the process of creating creative, active citizens within York to shape that as a positive vision rather than end up the sort of thing we've got now?
There's a gentleman at the front here. I think, did you have your hand up? You did, yes. I'll take two at a time.
They did a referendum where York wanted to be with the North Yorkshire. That was the original plan, to have it all together or separate from North Yorkshire. And in York, it was very unpopular, this. And this is why you've still got the City of York Council, because they voted against it, you see.
So we're talking about boundaries?
Yeah, boundaries, yeah. Because instead of, say, for example, Selby or Skipton, which would be easy to get to if you lived down there, it's Northallerton, which is a hell of a difference. And it's devolution, it's more like generalisation, because with devolution, Skipton, they could do their own bill, Selby, they have their own bill, Hamilton have their own bill, but no, just one bill based in Northallerton, it's the political this. And so, in my opinion, well, this is why York people will get dead against it.
So is the question about how you ensure that the constituent parts of North Yorkshire
right. Yeah,
don't lose their autonomy?
North Yorkshire, no,
okay, all right.
I don't think it'll work. But.
Okay. Well, if I start with the how you turn residents into citizens question, Ellie, I thought that might be one that might be up your street.
Yeah. Well, I suppose I can comment on the approach that we've taken through the competition framework in the sense of, you know, when students are developing their proposals, the city will provide the documentation, data, maps, images, satellite images, everything that's needed for a student to come up with a proposal to reimagine a space. Cities organise, you know, tours of the area, students go, they're there, they observe the sights, the sounds, everything. So I think having that focus, I suppose, on feeling like you are driving change and can come up with something and you are being listened to, you're being given the resources to actually make an informed proposal, I think is very important. And I think, you know, perhaps we need to break down the boundary between, you know, only certain people holding certain information to then therefore be able to make change. I think the idea of our competition is for cities to, you know, share relevant information, share those documentation, so teams can develop proposals and ideas that, you know, could be implemented.
Yeah, Joanna, I mean, do you find, you know, when you're doing your work in different parts of the country, do you find that people are engaged with the kinds of issues that you're talking about and that you are hoping to kind of develop? Like, how do you encourage that level of engagement, would you say, at a local level? Yeah,
it's tricky because people have to feel like that it's not transactional. A lot of the time people's attitude to the council is they pay their council tax reluctantly and then they really only get in touch if the bins don't get collected. So to have a sense of this is our city, this is our community. And I think with York it is tricky because there's a lot of students, there's a lot of tourists. And so actually, who are the permanent residents and how do we make them feel like York is? It was interesting, having moved from Manchester, the first time when the York Christmas market came on, I was expecting everybody to be really excited and they absolutely hated it and I couldn't work out why. So anything at all that makes their lives more inconvenient, that seems to be not done for them, that seems to be done for the tourists or for the students or for the people who aren't going to be here in 5 years' time. So it's making people feel that you're in it for the long term. You're not just here for an election cycle is the other thing. Making them feel like you're investing in their community and you care about them as permanent residents at least as much as you care about the people who come in and spend money as tourists.
And on the point about, I suppose, the geography of North Yorkshire and, you know, like many parts of the country, there have been evolutions in boundaries and, you know, where identity sits and where power sits. Do you think that this kind of latest iteration in terms of the mayoral deal is something that can work, I suppose, at an economic level, but still preserve that sense of identity within the footprint, if that makes sense?
Yes, but that depends.
Yeah.
You know, I think we've heard voices from the audience and from the panel that say that citizens in York don't necessarily feel empowered in a local authority area which is really quite small. I don't think size or remoteness has anything to do with it. I think it's about the attitude that is brought to the engagement of citizens that really matters. And I have to say, in that, I include students. I don't think students are simply transient. I think they make an enormous contribution to this city, which is often under-recognised. And I don't mean that just in the economic value that they bring. I think they're an absolutely essential part of the fabric. But it is about that attitude of engagement. And we have to make sure that that opportunity extends not just to those groups who are already articulate and who already know how to work the system, but those from the generally more disadvantaged communities that don't. And that's, you know, perhaps a failing of our current structures, which empower the affluent middle classes because they know how to work the system. I think we have to make sure that we open it out to all of our citizens and not just the smaller part, and that does include students too.
Hi, thank you so much for all of the comments so far. I'm the head of policy at the RSA, and I am leading a project called the Urban Futures Commission, which is chaired by Andy Haldane and the Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees. And we're working with the 11 core cities, but it's really helpful hearing the kind of perspective from York, that lots of the findings that we're looking into in terms of the role of investment, the role of cross-sectoral partnerships, the role of communities and kind of active citizen participation, that resonates elsewhere is really welcome. And we're also looking at it from a regenerative mindset and avoiding kind of extractive economic regeneration. But we're in sort of recommendations mode at the moment. So you've spoken a lot about local empowerment, but if you had one ask of national government that might help unlock some of that local action, empowerment and regeneration, what would that ask be?
Excellent. While you're all thinking about that, we'll get a second question. Gentleman there.
Thank you. I'm a citizen of York and also a graduate of your university, Charlie, so this is directed at you, and I apologise, it's a blunt question. Is there more, given the expansion of the University of York and York St John University, that you can do as an institution to house your own students?
Probably not a question that's unique to York, I wouldn't have thought either. I will just hopefully go along the panel if you've all had time to think of an ask. Andrew?
So in terms of the one thing I would ask of central government, I think in and around regeneration, I think really taking the devolution deals seriously, both in terms of the relationship and as I was saying in the empowerment, but I think understanding the public and private sector role, clearly in an era where there's just limited fiscal room for manoeuvre at any tier of government, frankly, then looking to private capital is really helpful. But if private capital always sort of a bit nervous about risk at the start, there's a whole load of enabling work, and probably central government has more muscle to help with that. So I think just being realistic about what that tiering is, and then working out how to make the relationship work, and being properly serious about it. I think that's.
Clarity is
clarity, but meaningful engagement, durable, relationships, and being realistic about what it's really going to take to succeed in these areas, and even going to different cities with different political leaders, different affiliation, There's definitely a sense that it is easier in some cities than others, and to make almost the same thing happen. Yeah. And actually, if we're serious about doing that nationally, you need more local tailoring and flexibility and creativity in that.
Yeah. Ellie, you'll want to...
Yeah, so obviously we work with cities across the globe. So perhaps I can't comment too much on a specific national government. But what I can say is, we are seeing a change in these world-leading cities of how urban spaces can be redesigned. Like, if you think about the super block in Barcelona, 20-minute city Melbourne, Medellin, these changes are starting to happen. And I suppose advice that could be applied to any national government is look at the examples, look at what is starting to change, and, think about how this could be replicated in other cities and on a national level.
So I was a retailer for 17 years, so I'd start with business rates. I think making tax fair is the sort of 3-word slogan if you want one of those. But yeah, the fact that big business can come into an area and set up somewhere where they can find the lowest possible rates and then get money from the local council to set up and then get money from the government to subsidise the wages they pay and all of those things that are not available to a small retail social enterprise that just wants to have a little shop on the shambles. That's where I'd start.
And your ask and your thoughts on student housing?
The ask is to, I'm sure you've heard this one before as well, for Whitehall to move away from this mad challenge and bid culture, offering funds through competitive processes which lead to resources being absolutely scattered with no strategic purpose whatsoever. Just one example. We had, was it the Levelling Up Fund bid process a while back. One project was funded in York and North Yorkshire. Where was it? Richmond. Richmond. Okay. Which is hardly the most disadvantaged. Actually, it was focused on the army garrison in and around Catterick, where there is actually really significant social disadvantage. But would that have been the strategic choice of decision makers in this region? I'm not entirely sure it would have been. So let's move away from that. I think it's entirely dysfunctional. We built 1,400 rooms, opened them last year. We're going to be building some more. We don't have enough land. We weren't given as much land as some universities were when they were founded. I think the issue is, and this is where the local plan comes in, to have a strategic approach to the development of accommodation for students in the city. Now that can partly be the regulatory balance between different uses of private housing. It can also be the development of sites, but doing it in a strategic way, because I fully understand that when a site comes free and someone puts in an application and then there's a student block next to a residential area, that can be really challenging for local residents. But there are plenty of places in the city which are not in that kind of context. If we had a strategic approach, we might do something different. So that those councillors in the room, if they are listening, that's a way we could think once we have the local plan in place and a real framework to do it in.
We've got time for a couple more.
Hello. My comment crosses all of you, really, because I recently come across something called the Preston model of local development and local economy in Lancashire, and which came out of a failed bid, I think, with John Lewis, that several big institutions in the city, the health, the further education, the police and so on, got together, employed a company, worked out what wealth was staying within the city and what was going outside the county, and they realised that very little, in terms of millions, was staying in. Most of it was dissipated elsewhere. And one of the things they did, they rejigged the contracts and broke them down, so they made space and ability for local employers to take up some of those contracts and keep the wealth within the city. It seems to me, I know there are problems, probably still ongoing problems, and there's a lot being written about it, but it seems to me a kind of positive model, and I think, why aren't more cities doing that? Keeping the wealth within their city or their boundaries. It seems such a good idea. Why aren't more places doing it? Why isn't York doing it?
So is the Preston model one that should be picked up and put...
Certainly as part of the whole.
I've got a challenge and a question. The challenge is to all of us. We can have had our thinking disrupted, challenged, made uncomfortable, all that sort of stuff today. What is it that we're going to do when we leave here that will make a difference to the reimagining of this city of York? I'm a recent resident and I love it. The question, so that's my challenge. What are we going to do, each of us, when we walk out of here today? Or are we just going to float out into the sunny day and forget everything here? Hopefully not. The question to the panel is, when you wake up tomorrow morning, having had a really good sleep, and a miracle has happened, what is that miracle that you would love regarding reimagining cities?
You should be a journalist. That's a great question.
Thank you. You've talked about the young lady, age. I can't remember your name. Ellie, is it? Sorry.
Ellie.
You talked about other cities you work with, and I happen to have visited some of them. And the one thing I have noticed is, which is seriously lacking in York and in other cities, particularly in the north of England, is an integrated transport system. And a transport system which is a service, not one like in York, which isn't a service, really. It's just a bus timetable. And also, people live in the cities. People live above the shops. Some of them very grand, very expensive, particularly in Barcelona, but also affordable social housing above shops, which to me, in York, which the city centre is dying, they would seem logical because it would bring people into the city centre, especially if it was key workers, affordable housing. They could spend money in the city centre, which brings me to my final point was, my son has just moved to Sheffield, mainly because of affordable housing and some more opportunities. And while we were walking around Sheffield the other week, we talked about walkable cities and the 15-minute cities, and he quoted someone, and I don't know whether you know the quote, it's about, if the barista who is serving your Americano cannot afford to live in the city in which you are in and has to commute in because the housing is... You don't live in a city, you live in a theme park. And York is very much in danger of becoming a theme park.
This comes back to what I was asking at the start, doesn't it, about preservation versus how you make it livable for the next generation. Yeah, I will. We've only got 5 minutes, so I'll just try and take us through this relatively quickly. Joanna, do you have any thoughts on the Preston model? I'm guessing it's something that you're familiar with.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. So I've come from Preston today. I live in Chorley, which is just south of there. So I do know about it, and it's, yes, as you said, not perfect, but then, you know, almost nothing is. And it really has made a big difference to the proliferation of small businesses in Preston. And the fact that we're now almost a generation of school children who've been through their entire schooling in Preston and only had services provided for them by local businesses, which is great. So it's an ongoing project, and it's worked. And it feels like, and actually it saved them money, because they were going to people, you know, the big providers, because they could give them everything, but actually it made a lot more sense to break it all down. And employment, I think they employ something like twice as many people as they would have done if they'd gone with the big providers. The money stayed in the city, and yeah, it's worked really well, and I would definitely recommend it. The thing is, it's harder to do because you've got lots of more bits of paper. But actually, arguably, that's employment, so you should probably do that as well.
I'll come back to the miracle at the end because it's a nice thing to end on. But on the potential conversion of retail into housing, into that kind of change of use in the centre of York, is that something that you could see being part of the future of the city? Is that something that may happen? Are there any obstacles to that? Is there any reason why it shouldn't happen?
I'm tempted to point to the councillors in the audience, but no, I think there are some developer plans to use some of the high street retail outlets which are no more or are struggling to use those buildings more creatively above the ground floor. And I think that would be an entirely sensible thing to do, and I think there's plenty of opportunity in York to do it. Can I say something about Preston as well, then?
You certainly can.
Yeah. I think a lot of that is happening, especially with bigger organisations. Certainly, I think City Council. I think City Council thinks very much in that way. The university thinks increasingly in that way. And it's partly because of that idea of community wealth building, keeping assets within the community. It's also driven by the environmental sustainability agenda. You know, we think much harder about carbon in supply chain than we used to. Scope 3 emissions, which we want to get rid of in due course. And you know, the further away from where you are that you procure your supplies, the more carbon you're consuming in getting it here. So I think kind of a little bit under the surface, we've made quite some progress in that direction. I'd be in favour of thinking whether across city stakeholders, especially the bigger organisations which spend most, we could make that a more overt ambition.
Mm-hmm. And finally, very quickly, your miracles. If you were going to wake up tomorrow, Andrew, with a miracle, what would it be?
So I think I just wanted to, I think just picking up the first half of the same question, which is really about engagement.
Yeah.
And I think it's linked to the miracle, which is, I think too many people, it's connected to the gentleman in the green T-shirt. If you ask everyone, does everyone get consulted on stuff? I think the answer would be yes. Does everyone feel like they have a voice in stuff? They'd say no. Yeah. And I think the planning system, in a way, sets a number of very reasonable hurdles to sort of get people over, but pushes people to sort of try and come up with a solution, then present it to people, as opposed to starting the other way around and saying, what are all the options and how do you engage stakeholders? So I think in terms of, I'm not sure I'd maybe characterise it as a miracle, but I think changing the nature of engagement to improve the level of stakeholder buy-in to thinking about the future and having a sense of shared endeavour, I think would really help unlock some of the more imaginative schemes.
Ellie, your miracle?
Yeah, I really liked the question about kind of other cities across the globe and the models they're implementing. I think I would love to see kind of what you were saying, more participation from students, young people, different sectors of society, community groups, working together to figure out a more decentralised model of city living that aligns with, the 15-minute city concept. I mean, it's a bit of a buzzword, but essentially it means, being able to access your essential resources within a 15-minute walk or cycle, and I personally think that's a really nice thing. So thinking about, how can we reimagine spaces to have mixed-use buildings, to have, flats and homes above shops, to have, a space that's perhaps a co-working space in the day, a restaurant by night, urban greening strategies, so everyone has access to a green space within 15 minutes walk or cycle. That's the kind of vision, that I would like to see for our cities, that ultimately, benefit every citizen, every resident.
Lovely. Joanna?
Universal basic services. So housing, transport, utilities, all provided ideally by social enterprise, but so that nobody falls through the net. So that we've got nobody who's going into poverty due to the fact that their utility bills are so high and they're freezing to death in their flats. So everybody can afford to live somewhere. Just basic stuff. We should be able to do that for our people. We're theoretically the 6th biggest economy in the world. We should be able to provide universal basic services for everybody in the country.
Lovely. And finally, Charlie.
One of those, construction of low-cost housing that remains low cost, can't be flogged off for profit and can't be turned into Airbnbs.
Lovely, fantastic. Well, I was going to say let's have a round of applause for our panel anyway, so yeah. Well, thank you, and we are just ever so slightly over time, but thank you so much for all coming today. Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you to everybody who's been involved in organising the event. There's been lots and lots of people involved in this, including obviously the festival itself, but also the RSA, the N8 and CAPE.
Can I just add some housekeeping?
Oh, housekeeping,
there
sorry.
are 4 things to say. The first of which is a massive thank you to Jen and the donor sponsors for today, which are Aviva and Enterprise Works.